Hello and welcome to this video in which I will talk about taking your existing IP from the classic Dynamics NAV environment into the modern Dynamics 365 Business Central environment. The title of this presentation only covers part of what this entails, as we are going to cover much more than just the technical exercise of moving your code from one environment to another. We'll also talk about the marketing aspects of your IP and what you need to think about in terms of how you can take your IP into the modern ERP experience that is Dynamics 365. My name is Daniel Rummelswan, and I'm a partner with Cloud Ready Software, one of the certified ISV development centers who can help you with just about anything related to Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central. Let's go over the agenda first. Since you are watching this video, you have probably developed some IP and you are interested in converting that into something that can work in Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central. I will first talk about how you can assess your current IP and get a good idea of what it's going to take to move it into Business Central. Next, I'll talk about a feasibility study. You will need to get a good understanding of how feasible it really is to actually take your code into the modern development environment. You might come to the conclusion that it is much more difficult and you need to do a lot of refactoring. This is all part of the feasibility study. Not to be forgotten are the marketing aspects. Even for technical people like me, it is essential to get a good understanding of all of the marketing aspects of good apps for Dynamics 365. You should know what it means when Microsoft talks about the customer journey, and you should know what it takes to provide that journey in your app. Finally, I will briefly cover some of the technical aspects of moving your IP to Visual Studio Code. I will keep this part fairly superficial, although I will show you exactly how you can convert your current Delta files into working AL objects for Visual Studio Code. They may not all compile 100%, but you will be working with your own objects in VS Code, which is pretty cool. As you can see, I will be doing a lot of talking in this video with a demo on how to migrate Delta files into Visual Studio toward the end of this video. I hope you will find it all very interesting. I sure do. So let's get started. The first topic is about assessing your current IP. I will start with some general questions about your software and discuss more in depth what it all means. If you are watching this video as an ISV partner, it will perhaps be relatively easy to think in terms of product development. And if you're a VAR partner, it will likely take some effort to switch your thinking from a situation in which you customize your solution for every customer into a situation where you define features that benefit a group of customers, or even more broadly, an entire market segment. The first question is, has your software been developed as an independent product, or has it grown organically through projects? Many products start out as a feature set that was developed for one particular customer and that were then used to implement another customer in the same industry. After implementing a number of similar customers, the partner develops real know-how about that industry, and that leads to a pre-packaged set of features that is then called a product. Not many partners start from scratch and develop a full product out of nothing. Creating a product for a greater industry takes a completely different way of thinking than developing features for individual customers and then generalizing it for the greater industry. Whether you have generally usable features or features that are specific for certain customers, it's important that you think about all the features in your IP and how each of them serves the greater industry. Next question is, do you need some development work to make your software run smoothly at the beginning of every project? So you have an FOB file that gets integrated into your customer's database, and now your customer wants to start implementing your software. Do you have to get a developer involved to make certain features run correctly? Or are the features there specific to a previous customer that needs to be modified or tweaked to handle the next customer? Do you need consultants to set up your software for all of your customers? Meaning, does your software run without the interference of a consultant on site to help your customer set the system up? Or do you need to have someone on site and do some data migration with your customers? Do you need to set up numbering series and account numbers and that sort of thing? Or can the customers do this by themselves? Is your software understandable and executable for a largely untrained user? Is your software ready to be used, or do you need to have a classroom instruction for the user group in order for them to understand all the features that are part of your software? This is important because in Dynamics 365, you necessarily don't have to get people on site to get the software into the system. You select it from App Source and it gets installed immediately, and the user wants to be able to start using it immediately. So whether you have to have a consultant or a developer or a trainer on site before the user can start using the software, that's an important question to answer. The next question is, does your software tangibly reflect all you know about your industry? Have you made an effort to actually document the things that you know about the industry? Are you making an effort to keep track of changes in the industry? Do you follow trade magazines or blogs, or are there rules about the industry that are important to implement in your software? Do you have a list of those requirements? And can you point to your software and point out features that meet those requirements? Is your functionality coherent throughout your software? Did you make a plan on how the user uses your software? And did you make sure that the experience that the user has in using your software is consistent throughout all the features in your software? Do you have a standard way of putting together a decision-making tree for menu access to features and things like that? How many things need to be set up manually? Can you start using the software immediately, or do you have to run through a task list of setup? Do you need to make sure that standard features are enabled, like numbering series and account numbers and posting groups and that sort of thing? Or can the user do this by themselves? Does your software take charge of the business process, or does it need to be set up meticulously in order to work at all? In other words, do you have an intricate set of setup capabilities that are very specific to particular pieces of process capabilities? Or do you have a process implemented in such a way that it's easy for the user to change the way that a process runs? Does your software support your users visually? Do you have all worksheets that are just grid layouts, or do you have visual cues? Do you have stacks? Do you have charts? Maybe some dashboard capabilities in your program that makes it appealing to the user to use the software? Are the messaging of sales and marketing, the feature set of your software, and the requirements of your industry in sync? In other words, you're keeping track of the requirements in the industry. You're making sure that there are features in the product. Are you making sure that the sales and marketing material reflect those features? Are you making sure that your market knows that you're keeping track of these things for them? Are you making sure that your customers know that you are taking care of their requirements? And a more technical question is, does your code base consist of a set of clearly defined, decoupled, and encapsulated methods invoked through the classes they are assigned to? Remember, this is a technical presentation, so it's important for us to also look at the code base itself. And you have to assess your current IP and make sure that you're putting in an effort to make sure that your technical architecture is ready for the modern environment, is ready for Dynamics 365 Business Central, which we recommend strongly that you implement an architecture that's decoupled and encapsulated so that you can maintain your current code base, but you can also extend new features. And you also allow other partners that build products maybe on top of your app to extend functionality beyond what you have envisioned it to be. Have you implemented override mechanisms for your methods? This is another question in whether you are enabling other partners to write apps on top of your functionality, so that maybe you have implemented one way of doing a certain process, but by allowing an override mechanism, you allow for the capability of another app doing that same process in a different way, but then only having the system run that process just once. Do you leverage design patterns, such as the discovery pattern or the handle pattern? These are all questions that pertain to the technical architecture of your product. Are you implementing an effort to make sure that the technical architecture follows design patterns consistently so that if you have a maintenance point, that the way that a method is implemented is consistent throughout the whole product? This is not just good practice as a software developer. It's also necessary to have properly written code for the validation effort, because when you submit your app to Microsoft, they do a code review and they will tell you if the code that you've written is not meeting their standards. So finally, in assessing the current IP, what's the scope of your app? Is it everything that you have done before? And if so, does everything need to be in one and the same app? We talk to a lot of partners, a lot of ISV partners that have large products, that have large feature sets, that are very complex because the industry in which they operate is very complex. And they ask us, do we create one app, or do we have a layer of dependencies between, say, a base app that provides some initial functionality, very superficial functionality in that particular industry, and do we then provide for additional apps on top of that base app for which you need some help? So maybe you have this base app that provides some really killer functionality that can be used without interference of a developer, without any training, without any consultant to be on site, where you walk your user through the setup of your app, where you provide these pieces of functionality one at a time that are simple to set up, that are easy to use, and you take care of some of the setup for them. And that gives them the confidence to start using the software. And if they then choose to implement apps on top of the base app, you can provide some help by including a notification that if you're interested in using another app, to get in touch with them. And by that time, they already have set up the communication with you for the base app. And now it's easier for the client to actually get in touch with you and give them the help that they need. The next topic is the feasibility study, in which we look at the actual code base of your current IP, and we analyze the code base object by object and write up in a document what can be done to move the IP into the new development environment. And so we do the feasibility study ideally before you jump to action. Of course, if you wish, you can already start moving your code into an event-based architecture, but the feasibility study helps you accomplish that goal. When we triage your entire code base, we look at a number of categories for what we can do with the code. So the first category is code that can be transferred to an extension by using existing events in the standard code base. And these events can be system events like on company open or on insert for a particular table, but they can also be event publishers in existing code units that have been added by Microsoft into the standard code base. The second category is code that you can transfer to an extension if there was a new event in the Microsoft base app. So Microsoft has added a bunch of event publishers in existing code units. So if you take a look at the posting routines like sales post or purchase post, you will find a bunch of event publishers that have been added to the posting routine that you can subscribe to and add functionality to those posting routines. There might be issues, or there might be instances where you could extend the functionality that you want to add to the base app, but there is an event that you want to have added in a particular spot. And code that you've added to standard functionality could be added to these events if the event was available. And in that case, Microsoft might be able to add these events for you. The next category is code that could only make work if the Microsoft base app was written in a different way. There will be instances in which you've actually modified existing code and added logic or commented logic out or changed logic in the base app. And the only way to make that work in your app the way that it is today would be if the base app itself had been modified. And those are the difficult pieces, because those usually come with advice of refactoring the code or leaving the feature out or the functionality, or finding a completely different way to implement that in the code base altogether. And the final category is .NET usage. So in regular AL programming, .NET variables are no longer allowed. Microsoft has added a bunch of new data types that can be used in code, in AL code, that replace most of the most common .NET usages. And you have to think about string manipulations, HTTP client, web service calls, all that sort of stuff has been wrapped around new data types in AL language. So in case of a new event, that means the code that you could transfer to an extension if there was a new event in the Microsoft base app. So Microsoft is likely to be willing to add an event to the base app is if that is of interest beyond the scope of your particular app. A new base app event is unlikely if it's very particular to your particular functionality. So if you can't make a case of the benefit of adding that event to the greater community of app developers, then Microsoft will probably not be willing to add the event to you. But if there's a case that the base app could be improved by having this event added, Microsoft will be willing to add the event for you. And the key is then, they're not adding it for you, but for the greater community. You can go to the GitHub repository for Microsoft AL and submit an issue where you can request a new event to Microsoft. I've seen instances where Microsoft has replied with a commitment to add an event within the hour, and then that event was added to Dynamics 365 during the next release of the product. So very useful to know this link. And if you're working on your IP in Visual Studio Code and you need a new event, build a case around that event that benefits the greater community and submit it as an issue in the AL repository. The next category is the code modification. So you have code that you could only make work if the Microsoft base app was written in a different way. The final category is the code modification, and this falls into two pieces. The first is you may be able to redesign your own code. By this, I mean you could look at the current base app design and figure out a different way to make your piece of functionality work. You know that you can't change the code in the base app. You know that there are certain events that you can take advantage of. You know that you can submit an issue for new events, so you can try to get them to add those events. But based on that design, you may be able to redesign your own code to make it fit into the app that is currently there. The alternative is you have code that could only make work if the Microsoft base app was written in a different way. So you are depending on Microsoft to change the base app code, which would be quite difficult for them to do for a particular piece of functionality for a particular app. And that brings us to our next topic, marketing aspects. First, we're going to talk about an app look and feel. Apps are different from on-prem verticals or horizontals. There's generally a different feel about them, and it fits within the Dynamics 365 experience rather than the NAV experience, which is on-prem. We need to invest as much time and effort into the user experience itself as we need to invest into functionality, or probably even more. Less is more. Simplicity is the key. Users recognize an app UI immediately. It's intuitive, it's visual, it can be handled without any training. You know that you're in an app environment instead of an on-prem ERP system because the user experience is much simpler. So what makes an app an app? There's clear user guidance. Everything they need is easily accessible, but nothing more. So the key is not only to present features in the app that are easy to understand and gives the user the ability to start using it without extensive training, but you also don't confuse them with things that they won't use. Tooltips. Every control speaks for itself. So users are used to hovering over a certain control on the screen and getting a prompt some sort of tip on how to use it. Media links to short videos explaining handling and background should be easily accessible. So you need to provide not just the video, but a way to get to the video in a place that is convenient to the user who is trying to use that feature. Downloadable demo data and industry data to choose from. So if you provide address verification, for instance, provide a download for all the postcodes for the user to choose from so that they don't have to set that up. It should already be part of the app when you start using it. And if it's not already in there, there should be an easy way to download data like that. Just-in-time setup. Set up data when you need it, but not earlier. So don't have the user set up the entire system, your entire vertical, the entire product. Only have them set up the features that they are about to use. So instead of forcing the user to confront all these thousands of questions that cover the entirety of your IP, just let them handle that one piece of functionality that they want to use right now. And if there is a setup missing, you provide the prompt to the user to provide that setup information before they start using that feature. Visualization, embedded Power BI and business charts. This is very important in an app world. You need to provide visual cues to the user. So provide them with nice looking charts with pies and bars and lines, and have a Power BI dashboard that gives access to easily accessible data. Have the data enabled for click-through capabilities and that sort of thing. And that brings us to the customer journey. So Microsoft is very keen on understanding what this customer journey needs. And so the primary goal of the customer journey is to get the end user to subscribe to your product. So there's a moment when the user discovers your product, in a moment that they decide to actually start using your product. And that process to get them from discovery to the decision of actually using the product that you provide to them, that is the customer journey. It's very important to understand, and as a technical person, I never really appreciated this, but this is vital. This is something that Microsoft has spent a lot of time doing customer research, market research into the behavior for customers who are doing app resource for their ERP system. The key point here is that you can lose potential customers at every step of the way. The first hurdle that they have to cross is they might not find your app. They might not find the landing page. So you have to make it easy for them to find your app, to find your landing page. So think of how do these users, these people that we want to target, how do they do their research? Do you need to do some SEO? Do you need to buy some keywords and things like that? You have to provide which keywords are used in AppSource that will allow them to find your product. The next hurdle that a prospect has to clear is they might not want to give their email address to claim their trial period. This is a fundamental question for you that you need to answer. Do you want to provide a trial period for prospects without demanding their email address? I know from personal experience, I am very hesitant to provide my email address. I hate to give my email address because every time I do so, I receive tons of spam in addition to the extensive spam filter that I already have set up on my email. So I am I'm very reluctant to give my email just to get a trial. So, but that is a decision that you have to make. Do you require their emails to give them a trial period? And the next hurdle is they might find your app too complicated once they've downloaded it. So they download, it's installed, they have a trial, they want to start using it, but it's confusing and they can't make it work immediately. You have to provide for a scenario that allows them to walk through some of the key features that you want to present to your client. So if you have a particular piece of functionality in a particular industry, make sure that when they start using your app, that you take them to those key features that you want them to see immediately without making it too complicated. So it's vital for you to pay attention to that journey, to have some people try out your app and to make sure that that works the way that you intended to. So the key behind that is you need to gently draw your prospect deeper into your app until they make the decision to subscribe to it. So within this trial period, you take them in there one step at a time. Provide one feature that leads to the next, that leads to the next, that leads them to start using a complicated piece of functionality. But you have to lead them by the hand into those features and deeper into the app until they decide to subscribe to it. Once your prospect has downloaded your app, you need to make life very easy for them to start with. Don't overburden them with setups and controls and features. Do it one at a time. Just give them one feature, one tiny little bit. Make them get used to the app and the controls. Show them one at a time. Provide a link to a video. Make the video short and sweet and to the point. And then what you want to pay attention to is you highlight only those features that can be run without any effort, without the need for a setup, without the need for training. One instance that I've seen myself is the need to set up a numbering series. For an NAV user, a numbering series is cut and dry. It's something that everybody knows about. But when I presented that in a wizard, a setup wizard for an initial client, they ask, what the heck is a numbering series? Why do I need to set up a numbering series? That's confusing. So we changed the setup wizard to create the numbering series for them. And if they want to learn about number series down the line, we will always have an opportunity to teach them later on. But you don't want to overburden them with unnecessary setup that's only going to take their focus away from the features that you want to show them. Another important aspect of that is to provide an immediate sense of achievement to the users. So you've provided an entry into a feature, some setup is needed, provide some reinforcement. Tell them you've successfully set up the system and you can now start using this particular feature. And related to that, it's important to reduce the visible fields and actions to the max. So if you have a ribbon that has 10 actions for the entire app, maybe you only want to show 1 or 2 actions at the first stages of taking the user into the app. So only see the things that are relevant for the user at the stage that they are for learning how to use your app. Your ideal tool for that is the application area. So there is an intricate system. You'll have basic and essential, but there is a hierarchy that's possible to be set up in application areas. And this is something that I would encourage you to do some research into it. Next is how to set up application areas needs to be determined by the product marketing management. So as much as we technical people want to be involved in making decisions on how the app works, this is really a function of marketing. The marketing people in your product development group needs to be in charge of decisions on how is the app being used? What is the path of the user into the app? That needs to be determined by marketing experts. So this is one of the key reasons why, as a technical person, you need to know how all of this works, because you need to be able to first communicate with marketing, but also you need to know how to execute on the wishes of the marketing. So you need to be able to set up application areas in such a way that it will comply with the wishes of the product team as that's defined by the marketing people. So the steps from an easy start with an application area basic to your full feature set with the application area suite. Enrich the user experience from basic to full in 3 steps, some immediate intuitive usage and feeling of success to deep dive and access to more complex features. So going from basic to suite, is in many cases a matter of a three-step experience level that you need to take them on a journey through the app. So especially plan for what is the first contact with your app, what should it look and feel like as opposed to the full operational handling later on. This is a journey that you should map out. Create like a flow chart and describe the whole thing. Document these wishes. Make sure that you talk to the marketing people and have a comprehensive plan of all the elements that come with it. So including the application areas, the wizards, the notifications, but also marketing material, a landing page, videos, help files that are accessed online, and all those types of things. So in summary, this is a technical presentation, but it's important for us as technical people to understand the marketing aspects of an app. And it is crucial. This will be make or break. If you as a technical person knows what it means to take care of all these marketing aspects, the app will be more successful. Our final topic is the technical steps. I'll talk a little bit about SaaSified techniques before I go into the demo on how to convert CAL objects into AL objects. I'm going to show you 4 SaaSified techniques. One is assisted setup, a list of setups and information about status. The wizards, which are step-by-step guidance through a setup process, which are behind the assisted setups. Notifications, which are used for a variety of different things in the system, including a notification to the user that a certain assisted setup has not been completed yet, and application areas. I've mentioned this before, but application areas simplify the user experience. And the goal with these SaaSified techniques is a quick adoption. We lead users to features through assisted setup and wizard. We give contextual information through notifications, and we hide irrelevant fields by using the application areas. The first is assisted setups. Assisted setups are available from role centers like the Business Manager Role Center and the Accountant Role Center, and maybe some others as well. From the menu, you can click on search and then type in assisted setup. And when you select an assisted setup from the list, that launches the wizard that's behind that assisted setup. Notifications, we have a number of different examples of notifications. One is, for instance, an insufficient inventory when you select an item. Credit limit has exceeded when you select a customer on a sales order. An overdue balance for a customer, an out of stock warning, and things like that. We also use notifications to alert a user that a certain setup has not been completed. So that would be an excellent way for you to take the first step into your app, that right after installation of your app in the trial period, you show a notification to the user that says something like, we noticed you've installed our app. Let us take you through the setup in a number of easy to follow steps. Application areas. Your app user experience is an essential factor of success. You need to have a very focused way into the app because you'll lose customers if you make it too difficult for them to like your app. And the research has shown that you only have 5 minutes to wow the user. If you do not wow the user within those 5 minutes, they will uninstall your app and they will never come back to you. So in those first 5 minutes that your prospect spends on looking at your app, if you don't provide an experience that's easy enough to follow and convincing enough for them to actually take a subscription, all of your development efforts may have been in vain. So this is what I've said before. It's probably as important, if not more important, to pay attention to the customer journey and make sure that you make it as easy as possible and guide your user to the most impressive features of your product as soon as possible. Or otherwise you can have a killer product that does everything that they will need. But if you fail to draw their attention in and convince them to actually start using your product, all that development effort goes right out the window. And that's a long way of saying that features alone do not make for a successful app. I know that there are many ISV partners and VAR partners out there that have absolutely stunning applications that have super features, and they are very proud of the success in their app. But you have to realize that in the traditional NAV world, you go in with a team of consultants and trainers and developers, and you guide them by the hand. You tell these users how to use this app. When they download it from AppSource into their Dynamics 365, they don't have the consultant sitting next to them. They don't have the benefit of a week of classroom training. You have to actually do this by guiding them into the app, and that's the role of the customer journey. It's all about the UI and the way you lead the user step by step. That's really the key. So setting the application area in Visual Studio Code, there is a property for fields on pages, and you set the application area in there. The screenshot also shows tooltip ML, which is multi-language, which is no longer used. But the key for this is that there is an application area, and you can set that in the design of the page designer. So in conclusion, your cloud app will not be a one-to-one replica of your traditional on-prem offering. It's going to look completely different. The way that you go into the app will be totally different. You will not have the same way of implementing as you're used to in on-premise situations. As technical people, we have to think about how do the users get to this point? How do we take them into a situation where they know where this feature is? And so it's no longer just a technical issue anymore. You have to work with a product team, and the product team has to know what the journey is. How does this fit in the overall success of the app? Assess the status of your product very honestly and critically. You have to be able to look yourself in the mirror. You have to be able to look at your own product, as difficult as that is, because often as ISV or VAR partners, you've spent years with large teams on perfecting the application, and it works beautifully and it is fantastic. But you have to be super honest, because if you lose that 5 minutes to wow, if they won't even look at your app because you did not pay sufficient attention to taking those users to those killer features, um, they're going to close the screen and they're never going to come back. And another part is do a feasibility study. Get in touch with Microsoft or an ISV development center, and they will help you do a feasibility study in which they will look at your app object by object, and will tell you exactly for every single object what you can do to take that into an event-based architecture and to an extension from there. So the goal is not to minimize a technical update effort. It's to build the best possible solution under the new UX and development paradigms. So don't just look at it as a translation of object. Look beyond that part and take a good listen to marketing people, read the case studies. There's tons of information out there as part of the Ready to Go program for Dynamics 365 Business Central. But also you can contact Microsoft, you can contact an ISV development center, and they would be happy to help you take the next step. We've come to the final topic of this presentation, which is about migrating CAL objects to Visual Studio Code AL objects. And part of this topic is that I will demo the scripts in Visual Studio Code and show you exactly all the steps that are necessary to do this exercise. The process of migrating your object from CAL to AL is essentially twofold. So the first process is on the left side here. We have an NAV 2017 database is what we have in the slide, but this could go back to, I believe, 2013. So if you have your solution in a 2013 database, we can actually accomplish this as well. So we need two things. One is your solution in a database, and we need the original version of that database. And the reason for that is we have to have Delta files. And for us to create Delta files, you need the original version of the database and also the modified version of the database. Then the goal in NAV 2018 is your solution in AL. So this is the end goal. This is your starting point on the left side, and on the right-hand side, you have the goal. So the easiest way for me to explain what the process is like is to kind of take start with the endpoint and take steps back to explain all the necessary components. So in order for us to convert text objects to AL, we run that through a conversion tool. In order for us to have the conversion tool, we have to have the Delta files in the new syntax, and that's key. We can't have the Delta files in the old syntax, and the old syntax is NAV 2017 or older, and even NAV 2018, the default export type object is old syntax, and the old syntax is necessary for CAL development. So the new syntax is specifically for Visual Studio Code development, and AL files need these Delta files in the new syntax. The only way for us to create these new syntax files is to run through this process from an NAV 2018 database. So the starting point for that is we have to calculate the deltas from the original system. So on the left-hand side, we have a solution in the database. We have the original version of that database. We calculate those deltas, and those result in a list of text files that are the deltas of your IP solution. So that's the first set of files that we start out with. On the right-hand side, we have to export the original objects to new syntax that result in the text files for the actual objects. And these original objects are the unmodified objects for the new NAV version. We then apply the deltas of your solution to the new version NAV 2018 database. So those are now applied to the standard objects, and those standard objects with applied deltas result in new object files. Those object files are imported in the NAV database and then exported as new syntax, which we need in order to convert to text AL files. We need to have the modified text also in new syntax. So we need the original NAV 2018 text files and also the modified text files in new syntax. And based on those two sets of objects, we then calculate deltas. And the result of that is the deltas in the new syntax, which can then be used to convert to AL objects. All of this is done in an isolated temporary environment. So I'll show you in the demo the creation of such a temporary environment, and then we run through all the steps to create those AL files. And at the end, we can just get rid of the temporary environment because we won't need an seaside development environment anymore from that point, because we'll be doing our development straight onto the text files themselves. So the basic steps are we start out with the deltas of your IP in a previous NAV version. Then we're going to apply those deltas to NAV 2018 because we have to export those objects in new syntax, and the only way to do that is to be in 2018 or later. Then we are going to create new syntax deltas because those are the files that we then convert to AL files for Visual Studio Code. We're going to switch over to the demo in which I'm going to convert the CAL objects to Visual Studio Code AL object, and I'll show you how to create a new VS Code workspace that you can use to work on those objects. Let's get going. We are in an Azure virtual machine. This VM is built based on a sandbox template that includes all the pieces that you need to do development for Dynamics 365 Business Central. It comes with a Docker container preloaded. This NAV server is the Docker container. and the right version of Visual Studio Code extension for AL language. You will need a proper developer license for Dynamics NAV to work with this VM. The VM also comes with some preloaded scripting capabilities in the form of the NAV Container helper. This is a PowerShell module that contains some very useful commandlets that were written to communicate with a Docker container, and also with a NAV tenant inside that container. You can see that the container helper has a number of categories of commandlets for dealing with the container itself, for doing some object handling, for installing and updating apps, etc. The scripts that I'm about to show you for migrating your IP are all using NAV Container Helper commandlets, and they are incredibly helpful. For previous versions of this demo, we've written scripts that use standard NAV commandlets, and those had to be quite a bit more extensive with a few more steps than is possible with these NAV Container Helper. These commandlets actually do the same tasks behind the scenes. So if you go into the NAV Container Helper commandlets, the PowerShell code itself, they do the same behind the scenes, but they provide much easier scripting and fewer steps than are necessary if you use standard NAV commandlets. And so they simplify the process significantly. I also want to shout out to my fellow partner at Cloud Ready Software, Erik Wouters, also known as Waldo. He's done the actual work of writing these scripts that I'm showing you today. And he's also created some very useful PowerShell modules himself, some that extend NAV capabilities, as well as NAV Container Helper capabilities. The Docker container communicates with the host, our Azure VM in this case, through a set of mapped folders. I'll show you where you can find these folders in Windows Explorer. First of all, you'll need to turn on hidden folders. So these hidden items under the View menu. And then we go to the C drive, and in there we have program data. And inside program data, we have NAV Container Helper. The standard folder in there is extensions in the NAV containers that we have. So NAV server has a folder within extensions. And I'm going to create a new folder called Migration. And inside there, I'm going to paste two folders that we'll use. One folder is the Delta folder, and in there are the Delta files from our old version NAV. And so I just want to mention that these Delta files are the end result of maybe one or more iterations of trying to convert the objects into deltas. This doesn't always happen right the first time. You may have forgotten to modify some things, maybe you'll see some conflicts, and even applying those deltas to the other database may have created some conflict as well. So it might be that in your example with your IP, you'll do this a few times until you have Delta files that will actually apply and compile in NAV 2018. This is totally normal. Not many people get it right the first time. So for purposes of our demo, we're going to say these are the final results. We have one folder of deltas, and that's what we're working with. The other folder is a folder with PowerShell scripts. We're going to use PowerShell to do the object work. And so what I'll do is I'll drag this script file folder onto Visual Studio Code, and this opens it in Visual Studio Code. And from there, we can actually look at the scripts. We're going to ignore this Git error message for now, and we're going to look at step one. So step one is to create an isolated environment in which we will convert the code. Remember in the presentation I mentioned that all of that object work for converting your IP has to be done in a temporary isolated environment. And Docker is a perfect mechanism to do that because it just takes a few minutes to create them, and it takes just a second or two to get rid of them. So if you make a mistake, it's very easy to start from scratch and build a new environment. And it's very easy. Once you get used to how this works, you'll not want to go back to the way that it used to be. So we have a few parameters. One is the container name. I'm going to call it temp dev. One is called the image name. The image name is the image from Docker. So this is called the Docker image. And if you're interested in more details about Docker, watch the video about how to use Docker and development for Dynamics 365 Business Central. One thing that I have Another thing that I have is the license file. So the license file, and maybe I'll show you that in the Docker folder itself as well. In the NAV Container helper folder, you'll find the license file that was used to create your virtual machine. So if something went wrong in that process and your Docker container is not using your license file, all you have to do is put your license file in this folder, call it license.flf, run the replace nav server container, and that'll it will recreate that nav server Docker container using this license file as well. So I'm using that license file when I create this new nav container. It needs credentials, so I'm building that as well, and I'll scroll to the right to show you the whole command so you can see all the parameters. And we have a username and a password. They're very easy. I'm just going to use this for maybe half an hour, so we don't have to take care of uppercase and special characters and that sort of stuff. The nav container helper command to create a new nav container has a number of parameters that accept user license, the container name, obviously, the image name, the license file, and then the credential that we've built up here. There are two switches, include C-side and do not export objects to text. I'm creating this particular container with exporting the objects to text because I'm going to be using those objects. And so that's why I'm keeping it. I'll show you where those objects end up so you can see where everything goes. And in case if you run into any issues with drive mapping and things like that, that's where you can look to see what went wrong. The ability to include C-side I like a lot because anywhere in this process, if something goes wrong or if you just want to go into the C-side container, you can actually look at the objects that were imported. And I'll show you after, I think it's step 2, we'll do some object work and I'll show you C-side internally. And so the container has access to C-side and that you can turn that on in the script over here. So let me just hit F5, which will start the script. As this is running, I'm going to create the workspace in Visual Studio Code that will receive the AL files down the road. So when I open a new window in Visual Studio Code, I press Control-Shift-P, I select AL Go, and then I paste in my migration folder and call it my AL project and let that run. In the background, by the way, you see here the status bar at the bottom is blue. In the background, you see my other Visual Studio Code session with an orange status bar. That means that that is still working. So I can kind of keep an eye on the background to see the status here. I'm going to ignore the Git message, and I'm going to select a local server. And this will create all the files that are necessary for an AL workspace. It's now going to ask for username. We can't type that in because it's going to localhost and we don't have localhost set up, but we will have another one that is called temp dev, and then we'll save that. And now it's going to try to access temp dev and it's going to not find it. And so this is now not yet ready because my container is not ready yet, but my workspace has been prepared. So I'm going to just minimize this guy and see how we're doing on the NAV container. That is still running. So let's take a look at the migration folder. So as you can see, there's a new folder, my AL projects, and I can open that and I'll see the same folder and the same files that were present in my new workspace as well. And so there's that link. So once we have the AL files ready to go, we can actually copy them into this folder and they should be part of the workspace immediately. Let's go back to the PowerShell. Okay, I had paused recording the videos because this was taking a pretty long time. So you can expect this to take anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And so what happens is in the background, the container helper created a folder inside of the extensions folder for temp dev. And inside temp dev, there's a my folder, a program files, and some other things. But this folder here, temp dev, is the folder for our temporary container. Now, it's important to remember this is a temporary folder, so everything that goes inside of this folder, when we get rid of our container, it gets rid of this folder as well, and everything inside of this folder is lost. So part of creating the container in the command that I showed you was the do not export objects to text. So by default, it exports all the objects in that container, in that version, in two different syntaxes. One is the old syntax and one is the new syntax. So these folders contain the entire set of objects in the standard database, one in old syntax, and I'll show you the difference. So here's the item card in old format, and here's the item card in new syntax. The main differences in these two syntaxes is the date. So in the old syntax, you have region-specific dates and times as well. And in the new syntax, those are replaced by uniform formatting for date and time. Boolean values are no longer yes and no, but true and false. And the final big difference is that in the old syntax, objects were usually referenced by object number, and in the new syntax, objects are referenced by name. So source table over here is the item table, source table over here is table 27. As NAV developers, we know that that's the item table, but in the new syntax, it's necessary to specifically say item because that's what the AL language extension in Visual Studio Code understands. So those are the main differences in the syntax. Let's go back to our PowerShell script and we move on to step number 2. Step number 2 is applying the delta to the database and compile. So we have a number of parameters. One is the temp dev container name. One is the folder in the migration folder, the delta folder. Remember that was not this guy, it's not under extensions, it's under migration. And I specifically kept this outside of the extension folder because I want to keep this. I want to make sure that when I get rid of my temporary container, maybe I make a mistake, I have to recreate it. I don't want these folders to be lost. So I keep them outside of the container folder. So this is my Delta folder. That's the folder that I specify here. And for this command, we have to get into the SQL command or into the SQL server inside of the container. So we use the SA username as the same password because that was created as part of the container creation. And the credential is the same as the credential in step 1. I'll scroll to the right side so you can see all the parameters. And as you can see, 2 steps. One is importing the deltas into the NAV container, and one is compiling the objects inside of the NAV container. So I'll show you what happens after this step. So I'm going to hit F5 and let this run. And when this is finished, I will show you the results. Okay, I had stopped the recording of the video for a minute or two while it completed. It's all green, so that's one of the indications that it went successfully. If you have a bunch of red in there, something went wrong. Okay, so let's go back into the folder for my container. And you'll notice that in my temp dev folder, I now have another folder called original. Inside original, I have 3 objects. And if you remember back to the Delta folder, you have table 27, page 31, and page 30. If I look back in the original, those are the objects that I have. Now this folder is called original, and what happened is it copied those files from the original old syntax folder in here because we are going to apply the deltas in this folder onto the original objects in this folder. And the result of that is in the merged object. So the merged object is a single object file that contains all 10 objects in my IP, and they are all including the applied delta. So these are the merged objects, the original plus the changes in the delta files. The merge result file itself is the output of the PowerShell command. So if you've ever done this in PowerShell, this will look familiar. This is basically a report on all the objects that were updated and inserted, and especially this guy over here, the number of conflicts is important because it might be that the deltas were not successfully applied, and in that case, you might have a conflict that you have to resolve. And that's what I talked about before. Some of this is something that you can actually solve by looking at the delta files themselves, but some is maybe better if you do it back in C side. So those objects are then imported into the database, and then in the database they are compiled. So let me just show you that part over here in the compile command. There's a filter on modified equals 1, which is true. That means that it filtered on modified is not checked, and it will, or where modified is checked, and it will compile those. So the result, if you go into temp dev C side, NAV user 123, you'll see, let's filter F7, you'll see that all 10 of those objects are actually in C side. So this is another check that you can do to make sure that when you go in there, it imports all those objects. So let's go to step 3. Step 3 is converting the modified objects into the new syntax. So again, we have the parameter container name, that's the temp dev. This is also using the database SA user, the SQL Server user, with that password and the credential. Let me scroll that over. It's the same command, but just to make sure you see this. And now we have a single command that does actually a whole bunch of things. Convert modified objects to AL. And so what this does is a number of steps. So first, it copies the modified objects from the original new syntax files. Then it exports the modified from the database, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't I just go and hit F5, and then I'll show you. That might be easier. This step is usually pretty quick. Let's see how quick it's going to do. Right now, it's converting, and now I am going to get this message here that I have my AL file. So you see all these files have an AL extension. That means that they are all done. So this is really it. So let me, for those of you that are interested, just go into the details of what this all does. So inside the temp dev, now you can see there's a bunch of other files or folders that were created as part of this single command. So this is a really big command that has a lot of stuff behind it. Stuff. So what we had was the original folder. Let me just go into the other one because, yeah, so we have original, but we also have original and new syntax. And so basically what happened is just like when the original objects were copied from this folder, the original new syntax were copied from this folder. So these two folders are essentially a repository of standard objects, one in old and one in new syntax, to draw from in order for our container to do this work. And so it's nice to have this inside of the container creation module, because if this folder is already there and you create another container based on the same image, it'll already have those objects and it just draws from the same thing, and all the temporary folders will be inside of your container folder. Okay, so we have the original new syntax. Then we have modified new syntax. And the modified new syntax is essentially an export out of our database filtered on modified. So it went into C-side, filtered on modified equals yes, and then it exported in new syntax. So now we have the original new syntax objects. We have the modified new syntax objects. So now based on these two, we can calculate the delta in new syntax. So these are the same deltas as we had in our original folder, except these deltas are based on NAV for Dynamics 365 Business Central, and they are in new syntax. And those are the files that we need to create the AL files. So we can do two things. We can either take the AL new syntax and drop that onto Visual Studio Code. And inside Visual Studio Code, you'll see that it understands these files. And let me just ignore this Git message again. It understands these files, but it has a bunch of problems in there. So it already says, I don't have a manifest file. The manifest file is the app.json. And now all these problems are pulling in. So what you can do is the AL language extension has capabilities to generate the manifest, to generate the launch.json, and to do all those things. But remember, we already created a workspace to prepare for this. So let me just close this and go in here, and we will copy these files, Control C, and we'll go into my AL project. And let me just open this real quick. This was my project, and just keep an eye on this list over here as I am pasting this in here. Control V, and now it shows up in here. So you'll notice that in here, we're not getting a message saying we don't have a manifest because we already have a manifest. This is the manifest. We have launch.json, but we haven't configured it. So if I go into the problems, Visual Studio Code is reporting 59 problems. So I can see, well, some of these things are, for instance, table item is missing. The reason why table item is missing is because I don't have my symbols yet. So I can do Control-Shift-P, and I can say download symbols, and now it's going to contact temp dev. And normally if you do this for the first time, it's going to ask for a username and password. But because I've rehearsed this before I recorded this video, it already knows it. It's already cached, and so it's going to get my symbols. Okay, so now we get a message. Symbols have been downloaded. And we can take a look up here in the AL package, and indeed we have the symbols. And you'll already notice that immediately some of these red markings were gone, and we started out with 59 problems. We now have 7 problems left. So you will see that as soon as you download the symbols, as soon as you download these references, the number of problems will decrease dramatically. So this is actually a point where you would start. So this is the start of you developing your IP in Visual Studio Code. So this would be an awesome time to create a repository in source code management. And if you're interested in that topic, there will be a full video on that as well, where I go in and explain how source code management works and how you can set it up for Visual Studio Code specifically. One final thing I want to point out is now I have my migration folder. If I look at my temp dev, all of these files were temporary files. I have my AL files already saved in a different folder. And so what I can do now is go into PowerShell. And for the cleanup, we can do remove -nav container temp dev. And look how quick this is. Successfully removed container temp dev. So if I go into my extensions folder, the temp dev folder is gone. And so all those temporary files, they're gone. I don't need them anymore. And it's a matter of just rerunning those scripts to build all that stuff up again. I hope this gave you a pretty good idea of how the process works. And I hope that you find all the details that I've provided in addition to the scripts helpful. And I hope you will be successful in migrating your IP. So let's get back to the presentation. That was the demo. I hope you've enjoyed this. So in this video, we've talked about assessing the current IP, in which we take a critical look at your IP and decide whether that goes into an app in its entirety or maybe split it up, take a look at the functionality and turn it into a more of a product-driven approach. We've talked about feasibility study, in which you get some help from an ISV development center or from Microsoft in assessing on an object level whether it's feasible to take your IP and translate it into the new development environment. We've talked about the marketing aspects because migrating your IP for Dynamics 365 Business Central is more than just a technical exercise of translating objects. You also have to take care of all the marketing aspects, such as the customer journey and all the material that's necessary to submit an app for validation. And then finally, we talked about some of the technical steps in how to address the marketing aspects and provide for those things in the app itself, and also the technical exercise of actually translating the files into Visual Studio Code AL files. If you want to learn more, please visit this website. There's tons of material in there, and I'm sure you will find everything that you need. All that's left for me is to say thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.